each individual's needs are important and each individual's rights are important, and that too is a rationale for why we need to do research on aging.
Isabella, we're so happy to have you to join us as extraordinary professor at Obtentia, Northwest University. Congratulations.
Thank you very much, Jaco, and it's such an honor and such a pleasure, and I'm deeply grateful to the university.
Tonight you will do your inaugural lecture, prestige lecture, and the theme is African research on aging, 4 arcs towards transformation. Why research on aging?
You're very right. Africa will remain the youngest region, and I think it's fair to say that population aging as such is still incipient and really isn't going to take off for the next few decades. But if we look at the absolute number of older people, the story is very different and the picture is very different. So at the moment we have about 46 million older people, which we define as people aged 60 and above, and we can have discussions about the definition, but this is the definition that's used. So 46 million already alive in the region, in sub-Saharan Africa. In Africa it's 64 million. And this number is going to almost quadruple to 165 million by mid-century, by 2050. And that is a sharper rise than for any other age group and for any other region. So this tells a very different story, and it speaks to the urgency, if you like, of finding responses to issues of aging in the region. But I think I would also want to say that looking at the numbers and the volume alone is not enough. It doesn't tell all of the story, because each individual's needs are important and each individual's rights are important, and that too is a rationale for why we need to do research on aging, to begin to find responses to individuals' rights and needs and where they are not being met. In the argument that I want to present to you this evening, I build and I stand on the shoulders of 2 real giants who were the pioneers of research on aging in Africa about 40 years ago. I speak, of course, of Professor Nana Abt, who worked at the University of Ghana, and Professor Monica Ferreira, who is at the University of Cape Town, where she founded and for many years led the Institute of Aging in Africa. If you look back, research on aging in Africa, the endeavor emerged about 4 decades ago. And in many ways we've seen tremendous growth and quite impressive growth in terms of the volume of empirical research that's being done, the breadth of substantive issues that are being covered, the initiatives in terms of exchange and capacity building and direction setting that have emerged especially in the last few years. And I think it's despite this progress, but maybe more importantly because of this progress, that we are now at a juncture where we can make a conscious effort to change the way we do things somewhat, to ensure that the research we generate, the evidence we generate, has more relevance at a policy and practice level, but also at a scientific level. And it's an opportunity that we face now. So on one level, there's been an amazing growth in the sheer volume of empirical research that's been undertaken. You know, rising from about 13 studies only in the period between 1995 to 2003 to about 85 in the period between 2004 and 2014, and I'm sure that number keeps on rising. Accompanying this expansion in the volume of research has been a widening in the substantive breadth covered by the investigations performed. So studies now cover areas of health, that's the dominant focus, living arrangements, intergenerational relationships, support, work, migration patterns, care provision and receipt, poverty, abuse, as well as some specific focus on older people's experiences in emergency situations. This is not an exhaustive list, of course, there are many others. There's also been, I think, an impressive trajectory of accumulating initiatives seeking to foster capacity building and exchange and agenda setting for research on aging in Africa. And yet, I would argue that despite this progress, or perhaps more to the point, because of this progress, we are now challenged and we have the opportunity to transform African research on aging towards becoming more relevant at policy and practice levels, more relevant at the scientific level. My sense is that there are 4 approaches or endeavours in particular that we need to pursue if we want to move towards this transformation, to make African research on aging something that's more akin to a true African gerontology. What would that involve? What would the transformation involve? It's a big word. What do we mean? What would a greater relevance mean? And I think Nana's and Monica's concerns and ideas give us some clues. So both of them were driven, in my view, by 3 things. First was a need to include and to consider African perspectives in global policy debates on aging. So the first arc, if you like, that I think we as researchers need to pursue is to make more explicit efforts towards what I call homegrown theorizing. I think up until now, much of the research on aging in this region has accepted rather uncritically the constructs, the concepts, the theories in the field of gerontology that have all been based on empirical work in the West, in the global North. And we must move beyond that and begin to engage very critically with these constructs and examine to what extent they are able to capture our realities and able to capture sufficiently well our meanings and our perspectives. And based on this, to develop perhaps refined models, refined concepts, refined theories that would do a service to the broader international scientific debate on gerontology. So we would advance that debate too, rather than just focusing on what concerns us here.
Yeah, we will be part of the mainstream.
That's right, yeah, that's right, exactly. So that's the first arc that I think we ought to make more effort to pursue. The second is my feeling that we must do much more to make the case for why policy and action on aging is important and is relevant at this point in time. We have had quite some success in developing policy frameworks and instruments at global level, at regional level, as well as at national level. Either overarching policies on aging or bills such as you have in South Africa and the Older Persons Bill or other legislation. But I think it's fair to say that for the most part, much of this policy architecture that exists has remained at the level of rhetoric, and there has been very little comprehensive action that has followed. And I think we as researchers must make an effort to move the status quo from policy to action. And that means taking a look at what the development agendas really are at the moment in our countries. And as you know, the focus of the development agendas is on the huge population of youth. I think 78% of population in sub-Saharan Africa is below the age of 25 years, 78%. And there is a sense that the most important and urgent tasks for government is to find jobs for these youth, is to build human capital, is to ensure access to sexual and reproductive health and rights and services, is to empower youth and enable their meaningful participation. And the idea is that if you do that, there is the potential of reaping a first demographic dividend. The flip side of that is a sense that if we do not invest in youth, it might be a disaster, it might implode. And so, coming back to the task that faces us, I think, is that we need to begin to pay attention and make the case for why action on the needs and the rights of older people is relevant to this youth-oriented development agenda. And I think there are many points of convergence and many connections between the two. It's just that we need to pinpoint and define them more clearly and engage policy more explicitly on those. So that's the second arc.
Yeah.
And the third one I've already mentioned, I've alluded to, which is that we need to do much more than we do at the moment to engage policy and decision makers. And for me that means that means two things. So one is that we need to engage policy and decision makers beyond the ministries that currently hold the aging portfolio. Usually these are ministries of social development or welfare or gender or a variation on that theme. We need to engage with ministries in other sectors, but also with the central ministries of planning and of finance. If we only remain in the silo of social development, we're not going to get very far. So that's one thing. The other is that we need to perhaps change the way in which we engage with policy. I think it's fair to say that often our policy engagement on the research we do is limited to perhaps a dissemination meeting at the end of our project and perhaps a policy brief where we distill some of the policy implications that we think have arisen from the data we've generated. But I think we need to move towards a model of what some people call the co-production of knowledge, where we involve the relevant policymakers from the beginning in the inception of the research that we want to pursue, the questions we want to ask, to get a sense of what knowledge is it that they need, what are the questions that are pertinent to them, and to what extent can we include those in the data collection and in the analysis that we carry out. And then as we move towards the analysis and the interpretation, we involve the policy partners again to distill what the implications really are. And I'm sure what they come up with is often very different from what we thought the implications were. And I think that will yield at the end, will yield a much greater uptake of the evidence in terms of informing the kinds of plans or programming or further policy that these policy partners will develop. And then the final one, which is in some ways a condition for all the others, is that we need to do more to nurture the next generation of scholars, the next generation of expert gerontologists or social gerontologists. And that means capacity building, and it means going beyond the odd short course here or seminar there. I think what it has to take is a concerted nurturing of a cohort of promising scholars across social science disciplines that have an interest in aging or are already working in the field, and immerse them both in the basics of social gerontological inquiry, but also progressively more in-depth questions and conceptualizations and theories and so on, and to do that over a period of 1 or 2 years. So a very sustained program of capacity building. And that would also require some engagement, some learning, some exchange with their supervisors and people in the universities who often haven't had much exposure to aging studies either. So this is something that I think we as a research community in Africa need to try and pursue as much as possible, drawing on the expertise that we have here in the region, but also expertise that exists in other developing regions as well as the global north of Africa.